So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Julie Rozenberg, right? Who is a senior economist at the World Bank and the lead author of the Country Climate and Development Report for Armenia. This is an important report. It's one of the kind of flagship reports that the World Bank prepares on the nexus of development, economic development, and climate. And it's very important to listen to its messages and understand, the development challenges that climate change presents. And I think highlighting the water issue, highlighting the energy transition issue are critical. Resilience issues are critical. And so we very much welcome this effort to really concretely present the challenge and the directions of action. Maybe with that, Vace, if you're from the business school's perspective, if you want to say a couple of words.
Thank you. We are very interested in hosting this important reports presentation. I think tomorrow is going to be a larger presentation for a much larger set of stakeholders, but in any case, except from the environmental studies perspective that Alan Sorale currently put, we are interested in the public policy perspective, and in public policy perspective, there is a wonderful list at the end of the summary that I just have printed out, and there are a lot of issues dealing both public and private actors, and it's about both pricing, carbon tax, water, etc. But and all of them require knowledge and audacity to act, because very often they are costly, but necessary actions that we should take. At the same time, not all of them are politically feasible. So there is a huge focus, or large focus that is interesting not only for economists, businessmen, environmentalists, but also political scientists, policy analysis, etc. And there is a lot of things that university students, my colleagues, can actually find in this report, food for thought, and actually a lot of call to action. Particularly what they are going to feel from stakeholders' perspective, water issues are going to be perhaps the most dominant one in Armenian context, given the size of agriculture, land, scarcity, population, etc. In any case, my whole point is that everyone has possibility to find something very interesting and something close to their field. So I encourage everybody reading and discussing this report in all carefulness. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I don't know.
The escape doesn't work. Okay. And you know what to do here.
I'll do it. Thank you. Okay. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's my great pleasure to be here. Indeed, we're launching officially this report tomorrow, so this is a preview of the event of tomorrow. These country climate and development reports, they're new flagship reports that the World Bank started doing in 2021. Now we've covered more than 70 countries, including Armenia. And the objective is really to look at the interplay between climate and development. And there are very large teams behind those reports. I didn't write it by myself. Obviously, there's a large team, including my colleague Irina Haplanian here, and others from energy, macroeconomy, water, agriculture, etc. So I'll give you an overview But indeed, the content of the report is very rich, and we cover a lot of different sectors and aspects of the transition. The novelty of CCDRs is that they really try to look at climate issues within the context of development. They start from the country's development challenges and development objectives, and then they look at how climate change impacts and climate policy interact with these challenges. And in the case of Armenia, the question was really, can climate action and policies help address some of Armenia's development challenges? Because the country is already facing a lot of challenges that are related to climate. The first one is extreme climate hazards that have been very costly historically for the country because of droughts, floods, landslides that damage infrastructure, affect people, and in particular the most vulnerable communities. And these events with climate change are becoming more and more frequent and more intense. And so we have done some analysis in the report looking at water scarcity on the one hand, and then at extreme events and their impacts on poverty also on the other hand. What you see on the map on the left-hand side here is a map of water basins in Armenia, and the colors show future water scarcity around 2040. It's measured by this metric that's called unmet demand, combined with how many crops are irrigated. And so what you see here is that in the Ararat Valley and around Lake Sevan, there's an increasing water scarcity in the future. This is in an extreme climate scenario, but that happens in a lot of the future climate scenarios that we looked at. And what this means here is that demand for water is much higher than supply. So something needs to be done about it. And then on the right-hand side, we looked at the impacts of climate shocks by 2030 on poverty through the water and agriculture sectors, but also through flooding. And what we see is that in some marzes like Armavir or Vayots Zor, I'm sorry for my pronunciation of Armenian, almost 4% of the population could fall into poverty because of climate change impact on those sectors. So it is an urgent issue to be addressed. And then on the other side, on the energy side, Armenia is suffering from air pollution that comes partly from dust and other factors, but also comes from the fact that Armenia uses a very large share of natural gas for its energy. More than 60% of energy, of primary energy supply, comes from natural gas, which is one of the highest in the world. And especially because it's used in transportation, that creates a lot of air pollution in cities, in particular in Yerevan. And then at the same time, all of this gas is imported from Russia, which creates high energy dependence. And there is a concern that that dependence might lead to potentially high economic risks if Russian gas prices increase in the future. So addressing this challenge is also related to climate change. Now, in the report, we identified two key transformations that can help address these big development challenges for Armenia. On the one hand, Armenia has a very large solar energy potential that can help reduce the share of natural gas in electricity and electrify other sectors like transport and heating in buildings. And then on the other hand, we look at adaptation and resilience, specifically in the water and agriculture sectors, but also in infrastructure. And we find that these two transformations can actually lead to relatively high economic benefits. The first transformation, that is using solar energy to replace natural gas and basically electrify the economy, brings energy security and accelerated economic growth. That is based on three priorities. The first one, switching to renewable energy in the electricity sector, solar in particular, but also a little bit of wind, a little bit of nuclear, a little bit more hydropower can be included in the mix. Electrifying transport, investing in public transportation and active modes like cycling. And then the third one is investing in energy efficiency in buildings and electrification of heating and cooling, and also electrification of industry and digital. Now, these three pillars of this decarbonization are relatively expensive. They cost additional investments compared to a business as usual scenario. It's about 1.7 billion in the electricity sector that are needed, 2 billion in industry, buildings, and digital, and then 800 billion in the transportation sector. So that's a total of 4.5 billion between now and 2060. And we find that more than 80% of these investments can actually be done by the private sector, because a lot of them have high returns, especially in the electricity sector, where currently there's already high investments that are done by the private sector, but also in industry and buildings. In the report, so these investments together, they help reach the objectives that the government of Armenia has fixed for decarbonization, which is about 2 tons CO2 per capita by 2050, which is a very ambitious objective. Now in the report, we also assess an even more ambitious objective that reaches net zero by 2060, because all the CCDRs have to assess this for comparison. That scenario would push the investment needs to 6 billion in the energy sector, with mostly an increase in electricity and in the energy efficiency. Now we looked at the benefits in terms of energy security. And so what we did was that we compared this decarbonization scenario with a scenario that would be only focused on energy security. And because another thing that Armenia could do for energy security is diversify its gas suppliers. Instead of importing everything from Russia, it can start importing from other markets, but that would have an impact on gas prices, because most natural gas in international markets is more expensive than the price that Armenia currently pays. But if we compare total energy system costs in the decarbonization scenario with the energy security scenario, we realize that the cost is lower in the decarbonization scenario, which means that you get energy security at a lower cost than if you were to diversify gas suppliers. Even at a negative cost, actually, after 2040, it's cheaper to decarbonize than to pay higher gas prices. Now, we also look at what it means for GDP. And what you see on this graph is the difference in GDP between a business as usual scenario and a decarbonization scenario. It's not absolute GDP. Absolute GDP just keeps growing the whole time. But if I showed you the two curves, you wouldn't see the difference between the two, because it's really small. So here what you see is a small decrease in GDP, less than 1% between now and 2040, that is due to this large increase in investment that is needed. But then after that, you get an acceleration of growth, and you get a GDP that's 2% higher than the baseline by 2060. Now, this drop is because we've made very conservative assumptions on where the money can come from. We basically assume investments cannot increase in Armenia. So if you increase massively investments in the energy sector, you have to take the money from other sectors. That's very conservative, and you could imagine that overall investments increase in Armenia, either through the domestic banking sector, through direct foreign investment, or other sources. But because we didn't know how much they can increase, we used a conservative assumption. And what you see is that even under this conservative assumption, the short-term impact is really small at the macro level. Now I'll switch to the second transformation, which is adaptation and resilience. And here we looked at how investments in water and agriculture and resilient infrastructure have a positive impact on poverty and also increase economic growth. Adaptation also has 3 priorities. The first one is increasing water efficiency. The losses in the water supply systems are very high right now in Armenia, both for municipal water and for irrigation. So modernizing irrigation systems and water supply systems is a priority, and improving water resources management in general. The second is climate-smart agriculture and land restoration. Armenia is highly dependent on its agriculture sector, and the agri-food business is a sector that's growing and creating a lot of exports. So having a healthy, resilient base, is important for growing that part of the economy. And then finally, we also looked at targeted investment in resilient roads, hospitals, and schools, in particular to protect them from flooding. And then here, the cost is a little bit cheaper than for mitigation. It's overall $2 billion, with $1 billion in water, mostly in irrigation efficiency and increased water storage. And then almost 200 million in climate smart agriculture, landscapes restoration, and another almost 800 million in roads, hospitals, and schools. And here, the reason why we managed to keep investments relatively down is that they're very well targeted spatially to make sure that we maximize returns. So for land restoration, for example, we only selected the areas where you get the highest economic returns for land restoration investments, and you get $4 in benefits per dollar invested. In climate smart agriculture, the costs are actually negative, and you get high benefits and increases in yields. For irrigation efficiency and water storage, we find $3 per dollar in benefits per dollar invested. For resilient schools and roads, between $2 and $4 in benefits per dollar invested. So this is to say that investments in resilience can also be actually a good business opportunity and generate relatively large economic benefits. And those benefits are not just reduced risks and avoided losses. They're also increased agriculture productivity, increased agriculture exports. And then for resilient infrastructure, you get indirect benefits that are not even quantified here, but on the users of this infrastructure. So we also looked at the macroeconomic impacts. And so here what you see is the bars are the drop in GDP that are caused by climate shocks in the most extreme climate scenario that we looked at. And the pink bar is without adaptation, the blue bar is with adaptation. You see that in the most extreme scenario, these adaptation investments don't eliminate completely the impacts of climate change. They do if we look at a more optimistic climate scenario. But overall, they increase GDP by 0.5 to 1% per year, starting almost right now. And then what you don't see in the GDP numbers is that these investments also reduce the impact of extreme events, and they eliminate the negative impacts on poverty. So we have done all these economic analysis to show the benefits that all these investments in decarbonization and resilience can bring to the economy in Armenia. But now we have to look at how this can be achieved and what are the reforms that are needed. And here, indeed, we find that it's a wide range of reforms, private sector engagement, institutional reforms that need to happen in order to deliver on all these investments. For a start, sectoral reforms are needed in all the sectors that we look at. And here, as just a few examples, the report has a long list of possible policy reforms. But one example is tariff reform in water, strengthening the institutional capacity of the water committee. In agriculture and food, setting up a food security, monitoring and early warning system. In energy, we spoke a lot with the private sector. They said they're really ready to invest in solar. The problem is that they need grid connections. And so the priority in energy would be to set up a national transmission grid modernization program and a national program for building energy efficiency. And then in transport, again, there are many actions that can be taken, but one of them, for example, to raise fuel efficiency and pollution standards for vehicles to give an incentive to people to start buying more efficient vehicles. Now we have to remember that people need to be at the center of climate action, and there's an important role for social protection systems, both for protecting people against extreme events like floods and droughts. Social protection system can be scaled up after an extreme event to help people bounce back, but they can also be used to protect people against higher energy prices or to help the most vulnerable people or the poorest afford low carbon technologies that are more expensive upfront, even though they're cheaper over their lifetime. The improvement in infrastructure can also be targeted in the markets that have the highest poverty in order to have the highest impact on poverty reduction. And then it's also important to work on education and curriculums as well as professional trainings to make sure that the population has the skills to work on all these new sectors and technologies that will be needed. And then finally, there's an important role for the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank in order to facilitate all these transformations and investments. And here, there's a coordination role that's needed for Ministry of Finance, but also there's a need to integrate public climate investments into the budget process, look at climate risks for the fiscal accounts and for the Ministry of Finance, and then potentially do fiscal reforms to provide the right incentives, the right price incentives for low carbon technology. And here, the basic recommendation is carbon price, but there are many ways to provide fiscal incentives to people. It doesn't need to be a carbon tax. Carbon taxes are very unpopular, but you could work with excise taxes. You could do fee-bates on vehicles where you have tax exemptions on electric vehicles, but higher taxes on polluting vehicles, for example. And then there are reforms that are needed to mobilize private capital, for example, through public-private partnerships, where an improvement of the framework for PPPs could help a lot mobilize private capital. So I'll stop here with the three main messages of the report. The first one is that Armenia has a very high solar energy potential that can be used to decarbonize electricity, electrify the economy, all of this bringing energy security at negative cost and accelerating economic growth in the long run. The second message is that climate change adaptation and resilience can increase agricultural productivity, reduce poverty, and boost economic growth. And then the third one is that in order to achieve all these benefits, Armenia needs all hands on decks, and it needs collaborations between different ministries, the private sector, with a series of fiscal, institutional, and policy reforms. So I'll stop here. Thank you.